get to the student of the game. I am Kyle Nash, the student of the game. And hey, if you're here, chances are you like talking sport. We're glad you're choosing to do it here with us. And listen, had to do another bonus episode this week. I know we're currently running through the NFL divisional previews. You would have just most recently actually heard the NFC North. Shouts again to that crew for jumping in and handling all that. What is it? My Bernier of Huddle Up Inc. is on like 8 teams now. I don't know. You find me a Vikings expert. I'm just throwing it out here anyways. But enough about the NFL for a minute. I'm going to my second language, college. Listen, for all my work connected to the Black and Gold Banneret, I don't get to talk a whole lot of UCF on my own show. You'll see a lot of that on the Night Shift podcast. Bing! But last week, you would have also seen it on the place that I like to call, or more correctly, I've been told to call, the Doce Grande, Locked On Big 12, where this boy wonder handles business in a fashion that I just only can say that I admire. Drakesy Toll, what's going on, my man?
Kyle, fires me up to hear your voice. It fires me up to be here. This is the crossover that America needs at a time that is so tumultuous that America needs. I'm happy to be here.
You know, it's beautiful that you're such a showman, and you set me up perfectly because I know we talk about your work with the Doce Grande, but you have a swag thing on the back in the background there here for those who aren't watching on the YouTube video, or you'll just have to trust me if you're listening via podcast. And now with somebody else in the conference, I feel like this is appropriate. But I dropped this plastic in here. What's going on? If you ain't swag.
Wow. Of all of the things that you have on your soundboard, that's the last thing even when you queued it up pre-show and said, hey, just wait, I could never have ever imagined. Thank you, Kyle, for giving me that.
Well, hey, now we definitely have more than one entity who is swag up here in the Big 12, be it Deion Sanders with Colorado or you hosting the Doce Grande. But let's get into it too, because I did mention being on your show last week. Yeah. Your term citing pick 6, by the way, picking UCF at 4th. I haven't seen that since. Like, I just saw something out on Twitter that said UCF at 11, which, I mean, like, listen, even Elvis is rolling in his grave asking why you're being so cruel with that. But all the horses in the stable was the statement you made. I shared with you something about Gus Malzahn's reaction when I asked if that opportunity of having all the horses in the stable, of making noise in the Big 12, of the college football playoff being in the air, I don't want to say rebuked, but I was interrupted for at least a moment saying, listen, we're just trying to turn around 6 and 7. Having more talent's great, but the job's got to get done. And I don't know how much you've seen of Gus Malzahn basically putting all of last year on him. From your perspective as somebody who watches the Doce Grande, the Big 12 proper, what's kind of your reaction when you see that?
Well, the first thing that I bring up is that Gus Malzahn has been someone who I've admired for 15, 20 years as a kid who grew up in Arkansas watching Razorback games. And KJ Jefferson's a quarterback that I've seen do extreme things on a football field as a kid who grew up watching Arkansas games and going to those in Fayetteville. And I know how deadly those two guys can be and how deadly they can be when they're put together. What Malzahn's going to do as he marches UCF into year 2 in the Big 12 is pull back a little bit. He doesn't want all the glitz, the glam, the fashion, because you see a lot of Big 12 teams that get that in the preseason and they crumble. Look at Baylor a couple years ago, TCU off the national championship last season. Will West Virginia, who was a 9-win team last year, unexpectedly crumble when the expectations were. Texas Tech was supposed to go to the Big 12 championship last season and fell apart. Kansas State didn't meet expectations. Malzahn's saying, look, don't set the bar anywhere. Just let us do us. Let us go out and cook. And horses in the stable, RJ Harvey could be the best running back in the Big 12 at the end of the season. And the reason I say that is because in a lot of leagues, he might be RB1. He might be RB2. In the Big 12, where you could argue he's in the 2, the 3, the 4 spot, and Ollie Gordon is getting the entire spotlight as a Heisman contender, everyone points at Ollie Gordon and says, that's the guy in this league we have to stop. RJ Harvey gets to fly under the radar nationally and certainly not in scouting rooms, but I think that gives him, the same as his football team, a leg up. He gets to be a bit of an underdog. He's not the main slice in the conference. And if UCF's not the main slice, they can wear that underdog mentality as well as RJ Harvey can personally, and KJ Jefferson can do the exact same thing. The dude's massive, mountain of a man. He is, again, this was Malzahn thing we talked about, as close to Cam Newton as you can probably get. And when you've got the guy who coached Cam Newton to a Heisman Trophy, I think you're in a good spot.
And yeah, you mentioned RJ Harvey, you mentioned all the running backs in the Big 12, such that it is, I think, something that's not being talked well enough about outside of Orlando. He's got his notes ready.
I got my Pick Six previews right here. My number 4 UCF team, number 25 in the country preseason, according to Brett Ciencia there.
I'm glad you brought his name too, because my silly self, I forgot it. This is what happens when you're trying to do UCF camp and Jags camp at the same time. That's completely on me. But let me build on that too. Something that's getting talked about enough. And obviously, because death taxes and the over in the Big 12 are the 3 certainties here we experience in this universe, not a lot of talk about defense taking place for the Big 12. I'd like your take as a conference, who we should look out for on defense, and then what kind of changes you've seen. UCF has a lot of transfers coming in to try to do battle to stop the run. I think you'll even acknowledge, hey, that was easily the biggest problem UCF had last season. Give me kind of your take on those items.
Well, since you ask, and I have all the information at hand, and again, I want to shout out Brett Ciencia and Pick Six Previews. I have no brand deal with them. I just love this magazine. I've always been a big fan of Phil Steele. Feels like it takes it and condenses it a bit, because immediately as you ask that question, I can give you analytics. And here's what the analytics say. They say that Utah has the number 1 defensive line, the number 1 linebacking core, and the number 2 defensive backs unit in the entire Big 12. So if we're talking holistically about Big 12 schools that are going to be good on that front, Utah comes up, Kansas State comes up, Oklahoma State's kind of in the middle. And I don't think that you'd be upset to hear that UCF ranks 7th on defensive line, 5th right now in the linebacker core, and 8th when it comes to DBs. That's not a bad spot to be in if you're UCF. It's in a unit that needs it based off last season. Because as I flip the book around, I can tell you, rushing defense, 125th in the country. On a scale of 1 to good, Kyle, that is bad. 115th in yards per carry allowed last season. The scoring defense wasn't terrible, 62nd. So you're kind of in the middle of the pack there. I don't throw a lot of numbers at you here, but one of the things I've circled, return production. 65% of the defense is back for UCF. That is 48th in the country on the higher end. And with that experience, as well as some metrics, passing defense, 25th in the nation, metrics that do bode well for you, UCF is in a fine spot on the defensive side of the football.
And an analytic people don't talk enough about, but I pointed out off and on the black and gold banneret.com. Bing! Constantly, you would see upwards of 35, even as high as 40 minutes time of possession for the opponents. Yeah. That means they run in the football all over the place. And listen, I have said that my opinion is talent-wise, it all starts with that defensive tackle room. I talked to Kenny Martin, defensive tackle coach there at Media Day last week. He says coaching them's kind of like, he feels like at times he can just sit back on the porch and just watch it happen. You can picture him maybe holding a glass of lemonade. Obviously, they work harder than that. But from a coaching perspective, when you have those kind of hogs up front, Ricky Barber, Lee Hunter, just to name a couple, the phenom, Johnny Walker coming up, Alexander doing his part too. I mean, that's depth there too. But if you want them to do 40 minutes of work for you at the size that they are, you are not asking the right questions. So, that's they say, I think the defensive line thing's a little low. I think it's because of the departure of Tremont Mars Brash and also Josh Saliskar. But, I'll put it this way. I don't think anyone's surprised. A team that wasn't in this conference last year in Utah is the top defense in the conference. That's all I'm throwing out there.
Well, and I should give, and we can move on from the defensive side, but this is the big highlight. I have different highlighters for this book of what I like the most. The big highlight that I have is Ted Roof has led the nation's number 1 rushing defense at 3 different schools. That's pretty good.
That is a hell of a stat.
That's why I have the magazine, Kyle. And you know what? One of these days, I'm going to stop talking about the magazine and pretend that I just know these things off the top of my head, but I highlight them here, and they're very cool to talk about.
See, but this is how you get CNC on your show, is giving him hype. That's what I think. I see your angle. I'm not silly. Listen.
He's a friend. He's a good friend. He's a good dude.
You're not just some guy in a fur coat on ESPN with the party animals, the bananas. You are more than that, sir. Let the world know. Okay?
I am what Brett Ciencia's magazine lets me be, Kyle. That's what I am. And nothing more.
Actually, I'm going to ask you to be more here in a minute because, for all the volatility in college football, the Pac-12 dying, just like I said what happened years ago, the ACC on the way out. Listen, you're too young to know who Karnak is, okay? But I can guarantee I tell you the future just about as good as in. It's an old bit for Johnny Carson. Perhaps, I don't know who another soothsayer. Let's just say we'll call me Nostradamus for now. How about that? With all that in mind, then I can speak to all generations. But what you're speaking to for all generations is the volatility. Like what I picture college football being is this big old volcano, and the Big 12 is this island that has sprung from it as some of the lava, the magma has cooled, so to speak, to rise from it. And there's different elements coming, all very volatile. The only thing we know for the fact is that the two main masses that used to be the college football Pangea are currently the SEC and the Big Ten. I'm loving this analogy. I'm going to roll with this, Drake. Okay. Anyways, the Big 12, though, is still a certain element where it's cooling, reshaping, reforming. I've heard you allude to you being aware of big threats to the Big 12 in its future. I've heard you point out opportunities for it to grow, typically connected to the, shall we say, poaching of ACC schools when that thing does eventually die. But let's start here to keep me informed on this front first. Threats to the Big 12 itself long-term. Kind of walk me through what that looks like.
Kyle, you talk about reforming. I like the volcano analogy here. The Big 12 20 years ago had Oklahoma and Texas, and they had those 5 years ago. But they also had Colorado, and they had Nebraska and Texas A&M and Missouri, and schools that added a lot to a league that at one time claimed to be at the top of the country and was winning national championships with the rest of the Miami was representing the ACC on the national scale. Oklahoma and Texas were doing it for the Big 12. USC for the Pac-12. And for the Big 10, you had Ohio State in the middle of that pack. And the SEC had LSU there in the early 2000s, where every conference, it was, boom, you win a championship. You win a championship. It just started rotating. It was great. We left that. We left that way behind in college football, and a lot of those schools have merged to be in the same conference. And now for the Big 12, if you look long-term, the last 20 years, based on where you were then, have not been good. And it isn't entirely your fault. A whole lot of that falls on how good the SEC has been, the moves the SEC has made, them coming and stealing teams from your league. Now the biggest threat for the Big 12 would be relevance or a lack thereof in comparison to the SEC and to the Big Ten. Kyle Whittingham, the head coach at Utah, recently said he believes those two schools will branch off past the NCAA. They'll no longer be the NCAA, create their own college football super conference and play their own playoff. Now, that is crazy Uncle Kyle Whittingham. He says a lot of stuff, but it might not be that far off given the gap between those two leagues in revenue and where the Big 12 sits right now. So that's a massive threat. There have also been rumors that the ACC, because they make more money out of the ACC network, could come in via ESPN sponsorship, take Big 12 programs, and that would make more sense for ESPN. That's not going to happen. The reason it won't happen, the ACC's contract with ESPN is up in 2027.
Right.
ESPN has from today to February of 2025 to figure out how they want to handle the ACC long-term. They can pull out of the contract entirely. They can try to rework it. And with Florida State and Clemson suing the league, both intending to get out of the conference, I can confidently say ESPN is not going to be as invested as they were when Florida State and Clemson were actually in the Atlantic Coast Conference.
And let me add to that real quick.
Yeah.
ESPN, we've seen them hemorrhaging cash on a regular basis, trying to assert themselves in the college football space, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I get it. The SEC's involvement, it's the best college football money can buy, even long before the NIL was a thing. But with all that in mind, you pointing out FSU and Clemson, which, by the way, I think Clemson's merely striking while the iron is hot. I'm pretty sure that once Dabo leaves and as he's dragged them into some element of obsolescence, in my opinion, they may be less of a player themselves. So really, we're mostly talking about FSU, right? And the concept of them being the big fish in the pond is something I think they would enjoy. After all, that's how FSU ended up in the ACC in the first place, was Bobby Bowden wanting easier schedules to play basketball schools, and then he started having trouble beating them. But nobody wants to talk about that here in Florida. Anyways, you were saying, Drake, continue.
with where these schools sit, with where the ACC is, they don't pose a legitimate threat. With where the Pac-12 sits, or lack thereof, they obviously don't pose a threat. The SEC, the Big Ten, and the opportunity for them to leave college football does. However, I don't think that threat is major or imminent because ESPN knows it has a strong partner in the Big 12 who's willing to grow. Brett Yormark is very forward. He's a business-focused man who is business first. And whatever builds the bottom line, that's the best way to do it. And this conference is in a spot where they can go poach a Louisville and become more valuable. They can have a sponsored Washington State come in and give them less money to compete at a high level and bring in more revenue for the conference. And I think those things are going to be great.
Would it be enough to truly move and motivate ESPN? I'm with you. There's no guarantee of that at all. Matter of fact, if FSU's intent truly is to jump ship, I don't think they're wanting to hand Boston College the bag. No disrespect to former UCF quarterback Tommy Castellanos, who's starting up there now. But yeah, I just don't see. You mentioned the Louisvilles and cats like that. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe the SMUs now. I'm just glad I remembered they were an ACC school. Like I just don't see ESPN jumping. Am I missing something?
No, that they won't. And at this point, there's a part of it you trim the fat. Boston College and Syracuse and Wake Forest are in a tough spot. Their EADA numbers in the last 20 years, which is their athletic revenue, according to what's reported to the U.S. government, aren't good. They're not good enough to keep them alive. They're not good enough for ESPN to say, we need this property. And that's what business is. If you as a stockholder say, hey, this stock is no longer making me money, I'm going to leave it alone. I don't need to carry it over in my portfolio any longer. And that's the same way that college football plays. So those schools, SMU included, they would have been in the Big 12 with those 4 additions, UCF included, 3 years ago. If they were valuable enough to come to the Big 12, they had to pay their own way to the ACC. That's not good. If you're Clemson, if you're Florida State, you're Louisville, you're Miami, you're obviously safe. Pitt, you're probably in a good spot. And there are a myriad. Duke, North Carolina, Virginia are probably going to be okay. So my big nugget, my big note for everybody, because Brett McMurphy reported, Ross Dellinger reported the Big 12 could be in talks with, or at least could be considering Florida State and Clemson. There is a world in which short-term, Florida State and Clemson for 3-4 years till 2032, we're starting to rework contracts with Fox or ESPN for the SEC and the Big 10, do find themselves with a temporary home in the Big 12 because the Big 12, through private equity, selling naming rights, making $2 billion+ in pretty interesting and experimental ways, where the Big 12, with that, coupled with the SEC and the Big 10 saying, hey, we need to hold off for a second, could house those two schools for a few years and make a lot of money doing it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beneficial thing for both sides 100%. I think there's this to consider too. And listen, there's politics matter and make things happen, okay? Absolutely. The whole reason that UCF didn't make a jump to the I think it's to the Big East the way that USF did earlier on was because USF actually worked to sabotage UCF, right? I think a similar kind of scenario could exist with the Gators trying to keep FSU out. Now, considering that the football program at least is in a state of disarray, I mean, listen, they've been to a bowl game, the Gasparilla, as I like to call it there in the Gasparilla Bowl, Malzahn's first year coaching at UCF, having lost to UCF. The embarrassment felt by other states in the school, to me, just doesn't make sense. It just proves they haven't been paying attention to this growing entity here in Orlando, that if you didn't see him as a threat, hashtag you problem, you're doing it wrong, right? Yeah. But how much of that comes into play with wanting to keep UCF out of the SEC, in particular, the example I mentioned? Is this something where the almighty dollar could still reign supreme? I don't know. What do you think about that?
So as far as UCF security long-term as a program, I think they're in a much better spot than in Arizona State. And UCF's in a much better spot than an Iowa State, than a Cincinnati. And reason being, number one, Orlando is massive. And I get it, Cincinnati's pretty big. And Arizona State has a market that's fairly big. I'm sure, yeah, you're basically Phoenix. But not only does Orlando represent a massive metro, I also got bad news about Arizona recruiting compared to Florida recruiting. You're in a hotbed. You're in an absolute hotbed. You go to Arizona State and you're like, hey, Well, we've got the bright lights and the bars. We got the clubs. We don't got the beach. We have the desert. You go to Orlando and you go, hey, we got Disney World. We got to hook you up with some mini golf. Let's take you out. Well, here's the waters. If you're going to do some fishing, we'll figure it. Orlando entices a whole lot of recruits. And not only that, it's close to a lot of these kids. Play on TV, play in front of your family every week. The Bounce House, I've been there. It's humid as hell, but it's bouncing. I love that part. UCF for the SEC for the Big Ten. Here's what I love about the Big 12. You won the lottery. You just can't cash the ticket in for 15 years. UCF's not there yet. It hasn't reached its full potential. 10 years, 15 years securely, it will be a powerhouse program above the likes of Miami. Somebody recently was like, well, Miami carries the Miami market. No, it doesn't. In the same way that Boston College doesn't carry the Boston market. Miami is not that big. I get it. There are bigger donors because of that market, bigger donors in Boston than there are in Raleigh, bigger donors in Miami than there are in Chapel Hill. They have Michael Jordan. However, if you're UCF in Orlando, you can eclipse Miami, who's in Coral Gables. Florida, in the way, that university in the last 7 years has just been stagnant, if not tanking. They just changing football coaches like underwear. Florida State 5 years ago is in a really tough spot. They've just started on their ascent. UCF can take advantage of the other schools in the state struggling and create a massive powerhouse for the Big 12 conference that maybe eventually the SEC calls. But for today, the Big 12 is going to make a whole lot of money off UCF for decades to come.
Yeah, well, I see the thing on that there too. You and I may have to have an off-season conversation this or next year about UCF's future past Malzahn, because I'll tell you what he's doing in the recruiting ranks. There is not enough noise being made. I don't know how much Pick Six talks about recruiting, but I mean the fact that he has, a top 13 class, not in the Big 12, the bleeding nation,
America,
is something that I think is getting basically generally overlooked, right? I mean, amongst for those coaches and transfers, obviously Dion is ranked, number one, depending on who it is you talk to. But that very same, I wish I remembered where I got this source from, but I think UCF was sixth. UCF, the school that's barely half a century old, is beating the heck out of Blue Bloods. They just landed a big-time receiver that committed to Missouri after transferring out of Ohio State, and now another boom announced by Gus Malzahn. I think, and the reason why we keep going to UCF, for those that are wondering, isn't just because I cover them for the black and gold banneret. Bing! It's because I think UCF, in and of itself, is a program that is closest in identity to what the Big 12 is. New, up and coming, kind of an island of misfit toys in the current volcano of college football, right?
Give it to me. All right. You did it. You asked me a question that the magazine's going to answer for all of you. Make me sound like a genius.
What can I say?
UCF in player development. So this is turning recruits into draft prospects. Since 2017, 18th in the country. In the country at development. Win conversion. Your recruit ranking, where you are in recruiting, versus your actual wins. So do you recruit and win better than you recruit? 13th in the country. Top 15 in taking the kids you have and winning with them. Turning draft classes like 56, 39, 50. They were 50th in 2023 in the high school recruiting rankings and are still winning. I mean, you go past at 52nd, 58th, 75th, and are still winning games. Transfer portal, 22nd in the country in 2024, 52nd in 2023. Throwing a lot of numbers at you here. I'll finish with this. I'll break it down for you a bit. Their 2-year cumulative is 26th in the nation in transfer portal rankings. What that means, because they recruited on a different level this past offseason than they did the year prior.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is this last recruiting portal cycle was much tougher, much more competitive, much more talented than 2023, and UCF blew it out of the water, killed it, absolute stardom. So those metrics put together, you're going to get recruited, you're going to have a chance to be drafted. No matter how low the recruiting class might be out of high school, you're going to win football games. And in the transfer portal, UCF is a unit. That bodes well for the future, Kyle. It bodes real damn well.
I mean, on this, I can't argue. So, hey, listen, it's a good thing. I believe Malzahn's contract is through 27. So, hey, let's keep UCF fans cheer to keep him healthy and in the building as much as possible. A local writer here for the Orlando Sentinel, Mike Bianchi, the Bulldog, wrote basically a Gus Malzahn stand piece, enjoying while he's here, because just the way this fan base has turned on coaches in the past. Scott Frost left before he could be the villain, so to speak, leaving after an undefeated year, right? Same thing happened to Josh Heupel. Was, basically, I don't want to say he was booed out of town, but he got recruited by Tennessee. Let's call that what it is. After a 10-win season, and UCF fans were, air quotes, relieved. I don't know. But let me get back to this, because it's a question I've had kind of outstanding with you even since the first time. And this goes more to the whole alignment piece. Again, the Big 12, in the middle of the volcano, the new island, as we talked about earlier. You've spoken to a good extent about the new rule expanding scholarships. I'm with you that I think that in part that's kind of a ploy to bleed dried, air quotes, less lucrative schools, those with less resources and money. I think there's some there to that. How schools exercise partial scholarships, that's a whole other thing. But something I was curious your opinion of: do private institutions hold advantage over public ones? And I know we're getting in the weeds a little bit here, but this is the reason why I'm exiting on this particular question. You mentioned earlier schools having to declare what it is they're paying who and what in a public forum. Private schools don't have to do that. Is that one advantage among others that they enjoy?
You could argue that private schools have been in a tougher spot the last few years, especially in the era of not just NIL, because so many private schools are much smaller, but also where scholarships have been, baseball, softball, namely, that they have less opportunities and avenues to pay players on the. I've talked to a lot of private school coaches, having gone to Baylor myself, who said, hey, we feel as though we have half the scholarships as somebody else just based on the way that we can pay players and the recruits that we bring in who aren't getting the Pell Grants. Some of these public schools are not just have access to, but have recruits who have access to. I think in this era, we're going to even the playing field a bit, but not give an advantage to private schools. That even though the information's not public, Auburn's still way bigger than TCU. And that part's not going to change. And Alabama still got way deeper pockets. FSU has way deeper pockets than Vanderbilt. And that's not going to change athletically, because the focus for public schools is still certainly there.
So fair enough. We got a few more minutes here. Let me leave you on this question. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, and I'll give you the opportunity to answer however you'd like, because after all, you are the one that purveys the Doce Grande. I don't want to show any disrespect. But can you tell me how anybody but Utah is the favorite? I love the defense. You mentioned the stats and expressed it better than I could earlier. Say what you will about Cam Rising. I like the veteran presence. And not having to do as much at quarterback with that in mind. Hell, our guy KJ Jefferson smiles when I ask him about horses in the stable. He points out I don't have to do as much, and enjoying that. We can even mention Avery Johnson, the young rookie in Kansas State, enjoying that same sort of thing. But Utah, if they're not the favorite, tell me why.
They are. They certainly are in my book. And if they're not, it's because somebody else showed up. It's because an unexpected quarterback like an Avery. I say unexpected to lead his team to an 11-win season. Nobody's saying Avery Johnson has to be the 11-win guy. Nobody's saying KJ Jefferson has to be there. Shedeur Sanders, Garrett Green, Rocco Beck. Any of those guys have to be that. It's going to take a young talent like that, specifically at the quarterback position. Last year was Ollie Gordon running back. This year in a quarterback deep conference, it will take the signal caller to take a team that's unexpected to win the Big 12 championship and go do it. And I think if there's one kid that can do it, if there's one kid that I have my money on, if he stays healthy, it's Jaden Daniels. He's got a real good shot at Kansas to lead that team to victory.
Okay, that's a nice drop too. I kind of forgot about Daniels there, but I do remember him being a good quarterback in games other than when they played UCF, because let's be honest, they just handed the ball off for 40 minutes, and I ain't mad at that. That's how you beat them last year. But Drake Toll, we could go another 30 minutes, but you got things to do. I got articles to write for the Black and Gold Banneret. Bing! Tell the world where you can be found.
At LO, I just love the magazine. At LO Big 12 on Twitter, at Drake C. Toll on Twitter. I'll catch you there. I'll be posting stuff all the time. Follow along with not just Big 12 coverage, but also the Savannah Bananas and the Party Animals. Kyle, always a pleasure.
Hey, listen, thank you for taking your time purveying over the Doce Grande as you do so well every day, keeping us all locked on, my friend. Appreciate that. Of course, I'm Kyle Nash, a student of the game. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads at the SOTG. Check out my writings with the Black and Gold Banneret, Jaguars on SI, as well as the 3-point conversion, also on Facebook as a student of the game. Check out the podcast, Duval Dive, here on Friday at 11 a.m. with my friend Travis Holmes of Big Cat Country. And then also Tuesdays is when you could see the drop of the Night Shift podcast, powered by the members of the Black and Gold Banneret. For Drake Seek Toll. Until next time, everyone, class